Will Aeneas make it out of the underworld alive? Is Rome a sweet dream or a beautiful nightmare? And what is the Cumean Sibyl doing for her biceps? We'll get to the bottom of it all on today's episode of Young Heretics. Welcome back. If you have ever been to the Sistine Chapel and seen the famous paintings on the ceiling, or if you've ever studied the paintings online beyond the one that everyone knows, where Adam and God are together and God is reaching out, their fingers are almost touching and Adam's about to come to life, that's obviously a masterwork. There's a bunch of other incredible stuff on the ceiling, and one of the most interesting details are these classically attired women that are kind of dotted around the vault. And like every Michelangelo figure, all people that Michelangelo painted were absolutely yoked, but this woman in particular looks like juiced to the gills. This was before the invention of tren, but she's obviously foreseen it because she is the Cumean Sibyl. And this is a character, if you think of Western history as like a long-running sitcom, if you think of Western literature and the classics as kind of episodes in this giant TV show, the Cumean Sibyl is one of those recurring characters, like Janice on Friends. If you watch Friends, this is Chandler's like on-again, off-again girlfriend, and she always comes back, and we all know her, and she's got this hilarious voice, and everyone, like the minute she comes in, we kind of know what sort of gags we're in for. There are a couple of figures like this in Western literature, where there's no one great work that really features this person as the main character, but they're an incredible supporting character, actor or actress. And the Cumean Sibyl, I kind of think of her like that. There are others. There's like Tiresias, for example. Actually, prophets tend to fill this role where it's like there's a bunch of different myths that feature this character, but they never really take center stage. Well, today, the Cumean Sibyl is one of those recurring characters who's going to get her moment in the sun. We have gotten to book 6 of the Aeneid. It's probably my favorite book. I'm not having a very original opinion, though, when I say that, because this is the one that everyone remembers. If you remember any book from the Aeneid, it's going to be this one. We are going to take our time with it because it's an incredibly rich text. There is a translation just of this book by the great poet Seamus Heaney, because it stands alone as its own work of literature. It has so much influence on, of course, Dante, the later medieval author of the Divine Comedy, one of the great first kind of masterworks in Italian, in the vulgar tongue rather than in Latin, a lodestone in the history of the West. Virgil leads Dante through hell and through purgatory, and that is very much influenced by this central episode in the story of Aeneas, which is a kind of episode called a katabasis. We've talked about this before. When we did the Odyssey, we talked about Odysseus reaching out to the souls of the underworld, and this has become a kind of type scene. The word katabasis means going down, downward descent into the underworld. It's a central hinge point of the hero's journey. And when I say that term, a lot of people might think about Joseph Campbell and Star Wars and the kind of archetypal sequence of events that is supposed to happen in all these different heroes' journeys. There was nothing quite so distinctly laid out, so codified at the time, but all the stories that we use as examples of the classic hero's journey are from this period of the ancient literature. And so when we talk about Aeneas, we can see almost like hero's journey core. He goes on this distilled version of the journey that many other heroes have gone through. And this is the point where you have to kind of go into the darkest place, the place where categories break down, the boundary between life and death vanishes. It's both a womb and a grave, and there's something there that you need, some information, some guidance. And Aeneas is really in need of that right now. He desperately needs guidance because, if you will recall, he's just commemorated the 1-year anniversary of his father's death. And that happened after probably the lowest point in his journey thus far, although he's had a lot of devastating episodes. He had the fall of Troy, then he ended up washed up on Carthage, and in Carthage he met Dido, and it was in Dido's kingdom, after the death of his father, completely adrift, without a home, without a guide, that he fell into this terrible love affair that was in many ways a kind of a cruel trick of fate, but was also a terrible failure on Aeneas' part because he let go of his responsibilities. And the whole poem is about living under the weight of this destiny to found Rome. That's where he's going. He knows that's where he's going, but he can't get his head in the game. He can't get his soul in the right place to be the man that can do that. And so he's in some ways, he's now turned his face toward his destiny. After Dido, he's gotten kind of a wake-up call from the gods. He knows he has to move forward toward this goal, but also his great trial, the transformative trial that will make him into the man that can found Rome, lies ahead of him. And he knows it lies ahead of him, and that's what he's doing today. He's going to Cumae, which is a Greek colony on the coast of Italy, and there is where he will meet this terrifying, imposing, fascinating, riveting figure that has had such an effect on the history of the West, the Cumean Sibyl. Since we're on the subject of the katabasis, the hero's journey, the arduous labor that you have to achieve before you can become the man you're meant to be, this is a perfect opportunity for me to introduce to you our new sponsor. I'm delighted that Young Heretics is now sponsored by Aletheia Travel. That's Alithea Travel. This is also a journey, a trip to Greece, to Samos, which is, some people would call it the birthplace of philosophy. It's where Pythagoras got his start, and it's an incredibly significant location. It's also gorgeous. The Aletheia folks are taking a group of 8 to 12 guys. This is a men's trip called Strength and Virtue, and they're going to take these folks on kind of a guided tour of Greece, but with a philosophical purpose. And the purpose is right there in the title, Strength and Virtue. This is a fantastic opportunity to do something I'm always talking about on the show, which is to put the ideals of the West into practice. There are a lot of men's trips out there. There are a lot of companies that will sell you kind of like a manly experience or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of them, I think, may or may not be worth your time. This one really is. And it's because of its connection to this philosophical ideal. I've said before on the show that every great philosopher practically throughout history has understood that we are not just brains. We can't just be brains in jars, much as I might like to sit around forever and just think. I and everyone, we all need to get out there into the world and do hard things that test our actual application of the ideals that we have. We are not just minds, we are minds, bodies, and souls. We have to cultivate all three. And this is a trip with a few guys that want to get together and work on that in community, because the other part of this is you have to have brothers that are going to support you, that are going to encourage you and kind of get you off your butt when you're feeling down. The whole trip is 8 days long, and there's a bunch of different challenges and really thoughtfully arranged, hikes and lifting and working out, but also discussing and working kind of on yourself and on your intellectual development. It's not just an isolated experience. There's opportunities before and after to kind of cultivate those relationships, which I think is so sorely needful in this moment when, we're all kind of disconnected from one another and on our phones. So I would love to go on this trip myself. I can't go on this one because it's coming up in September and I've got something else going on. But if you are available, or if a man in your life is available, your brother, your son, your friend, if you think that somebody could benefit from this, I think it would just be a tremendous opportunity. It's called Strength and Virtue, and it's at alithea.travel.com, Alithea travel.com. If you are a Young Heretics listener, and only if you are a Young Heretics listener, you can get $500 off the fee. And this fee includes everything, all the transportation throughout the trip, except for your airfare, accommodation, activities, logistics. A lot of the meals are included, and $500 off of that fee if you put in Heretics, Heretics, as a discount code at checkout. One more time, it's alitheatravel.com, ALITHEA travel.com, and the trip is called Strength and Virtue. I think you would really enjoy it. If you do check it out, let me know, because I'd love to hear about your experience. Okay, now let's talk about the journey of Aeneas. I mentioned that he's on his way now remember, he's been in Sicily celebrating or commemorating the 1-year anniversary of his father's death. Now he's going to go see his father in the underworld, and the portal to the underworld is in Cumae. Cumae is kind of, if you picture the boot of Italy that stretches down into the Mediterranean, Cumae is like midway up on the western coast, which sort of slants to the west. And as he's traveling up north, he's going up the coast, and he's going to arrive at this very famous, very significant location. It's probably the oldest Greek settlement on the mainland of Italy. So there have been people there. There's a history there. And that history connects the mainland of Italy, which is where Aeneas is going to end up founding what will become Rome, connects that to the ancient Greek world. So one of the things that's up ahead for Aeneas is a confrontation with the future of Rome as distinct from this ancient culture and civilization of Greece, which was always looming in the history of Rome. And Aeneas has to grapple with, what can we take from that culture and what do we have to leave behind? So Cumae is a very appropriate place for him to be in that way. Of course, it's also got this connection to the Sibyl. The other thing that it has a fascinating connection to, and this is actually relevant to what's about to happen to Aeneas, the other thing that Cumae is kind of significant for is that it is probably Cumae that gave the Romans the alphabet that we now use. Our version of the alphabet is descended from the Latin version of the alphabet, and that Latin version is in turn descended from the Greek alphabet. All of these alphabets, by the way, are really just one alphabet. Variants, the Hebrew alphabet, the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, they look very different now, but it's kind of like the Indo-European languages, like Sanskrit and English and Latin and Greek and the Romance languages are all related to this very distant ancestor. Our alphabets are the same way, and the relationships are slightly different, but similarly, there's kind of this original, we're not quite sure exactly what the original one was, but it seems to have come kind of out of Egypt via the Near East, and the Phoenicians, whom we've talked about before, because they're the kind of they're where Dido's Carthaginians come from. The Phoenicians are the ones that seem to have spread it around the world because they were the seafaring people, and there's a Phoenician alphabet out of which develops, among other things, the Greek alphabet. And so the subsequent kind of history as it splits apart from what will become the Hebrew alphabet is all based on these few shapes, but each different local region is kind of uses a different version. There's no internet at this point. There's no central kind of authority that can standardize some of these shapes and letter forms. And so there are all these different regional variants. And the variant that we get in Cumae, if we look at inscriptions and we look at the history of the place, is the Euboean variant of the Greek alphabet. Euboea is a big old island. If you picture now, go over from Italy in your head and go to Greece. Along that eastern coast, there is a big, long island, and that's called Euboea. It's an enormous and quite significant region, in part because they send these colonists out, including to Cumae. And the reason that matters for the alphabet is that their variant, the Euboean variant of the alphabet, uses all of these letters that are different from the Greek alphabet, but that we then pick up and use. So the Euboeans are responsible, for example, for our letter H. In the Greek alphabet, the H symbol, if you think of a capital H, that usually stands in for an eta, which is like an A sound, but the Euboeans use it for a H, for an H sound. And so that's why H sounds like H in our languages, because it came via the Etruscans to the Romans in Latin. Also, similarly, the X symbol, which sounds like K in Greek, sounds like KS in the Euboean variant of Greek, and that's where we get our letter X. We also owe the Euboeans the letter Q, which has an ancestor called Koppa. We owe them a bunch of different kind of stuff that is distinctive to the Latin alphabet and therefore distinctive to the alphabet that we now use. So that is, to me, kind of fascinating in a King of the Nerds sort of way. But it's also quite significant. And I think that history is in the background here because of the way the Sibyl is represented. When we first hear about her in the poem, we are told that part of the way she prophesies is through writing. Now, this is going back to book 3, when we first heard that this is something we're going to have to do. You may recall that Helenus told Aeneas where he was supposed to go, and he mentioned the Sibyl in this very, very ominous passage, which I've translated for you, and I'm just going to read to remind you about how the Sibyl usually works. And it is with this tool of the alphabet, which is so significant. I mean, if you think about writing as a technology in this time, it's one of the major developments in civilization, and it preserves history, right? It lays things down in a way that can endure beyond just individual human lives. So in some ways, it's the power of the future. It's the power of immortality. And that is the power that the Sibyl offers. She is a conduit to the future. She's a prophetess, conduit to the afterworld. So it makes sense that she's connected to this Euboean transmission of the alphabet. She's writing these things down, but she does it in a very fascinating way that let me just read this to you. So this is Helenus who tells Aeneas where he has to go. He says, "Your course will bring you to a city, Cumae, and Averna's sacred lakes and whispering woods. The unhinged prophetess beneath the nether crags will then appear." And here's the part about the writing. She sings of fate and writes on leaves, entrusts them with the names and secret signs she knows. Whatever song this virgin etches on her leaves, she splits up into parts and shuts within the cave. And those that stay in place, unmoved and orderly, are true. But if a wind slips in, and if the door swings on its hinges to disturb the tender fronds, she never snatches at them, whirling through the air within that hollow rock, or puts them back in place, or readjoins the pieces of her scattered song. It's a very haunting image, and from the get-go, we know that this is going to be a set piece, because this character is just totally riveting. The unhinged prophetess beneath the nether crags. Insanam vates aspicias, you will behold the insane prophetess. And a vates is a figure that we know not just as a prophet, but as a poet, an artist, a conduit to the regions beyond, to the gods. All of these things are kind of together in this figure whom Virgil did not invent, and the Roman audience would have known to expect her as this cloaked, cowled, kind of half-mad woman, but it's a divine madness. And the technology of writing here is this amazing kind of metaphor or image, because what she's doing is she's kind of connecting this realm to the realm of eternity, to the realm that knows the future, but she's doing it in this way that is kind of disjointed and disconnected, which is always how we seem to grope toward our visions of the divine, right? Writing itself is both this incredible gift, this incredible tool that we're able to use to carry things on into the future, but it also is this kind of heartbreaking, poignant, tantalizing thing because it is always betraying us. It's always falling. We lose things. The Library of Alexandria gets burned. The letters get kind of scrubbed out of the etchings. Monuments fall. And this history, which is very much present and alive to us now, is also already going on by the time Virgil is writing. And his concern, his question is like, what can we preserve? What can we carry forward from the past of the Greek history? That's one of his major issues because he's always dealing with, his relationship to Homer and to Rome's relationship to Greece. And this image of the prophetess who is carrying you forward into the future, but with these partial kind of patchy, it's like a radio signal that never quite gets through. That's what our relationship to history is and how we carry the past into the future. If you've read Remembrance of Earth's Past, this is the trilogy that begins with the three-body problem. Cixin Liu, the Chinese science fiction writer, made kind of a splash on Netflix fairly recently. The first one is the famous one, but there's three, and there's a major image as the story kind of expands light years and light years out, and eons, generations and generations. It's a big epic story, but it ends with people kind of trying to think of a kind of writing that will endure for millions and millions of years, because they need to communicate to future generations. And it's a wonderful moment because they've got all of this advanced technology that's been discussed throughout the book, all of these, digital means of information processing and all of that, but they end up just like carving these big letters into the hills, because that's the thing that is most likely, the rock is the thing that's most likely to endure. And this is something that we think about now, is that we've got all this digital information, but it's actually less permanent than some of these old modes of like carving. Like the Herculaneum scrolls of Vesuvius have endured longer than perhaps like many digital databases will. And yet even those, right, are charred with ash, and there's this terrible poignancy to history of the things that we lose. And that's our condition as human beings. So Virgil is like really alive to this. And the Sibyl is the figure that her madness kind of represents that. It's like the truth of things is so much bigger than our little vessels, even our alphabet, our writing can contain, that it's always bursting out, and it always makes us a little bit deranged. So this is a very alarming, frightening, kind of ominous figure. And as I said, she's a major figure. The Sibyl is a major figure in the history of the West. In fact, it's not just the Cumean Sibyl. All of the prophetesses who we think may have been kind of huffing some sort of noxious gas or entering into a trance, these are all called Sibyls. It's basically a word, if you think of our word medium, right? Like the medium that contacts the ghosts or the spirits of the beyond, that's a Sibyl. If you have read Harry Potter, you know that the teacher of like divination is called Sybil Trelawney, played by Emma Stone wonderfully in the movies. And the thing about her, which is actually quite consistent with this literary tradition, is that she is mostly a fraud, except for like, I think it's 2 times she's taken over and she doesn't even remember. She's sort of like gripped by this passionate vision or trance, and she prophesies a real prophecy to Harry and his friends. But that's because she is a Sibyl, and that's literally her name. It's a word that basically means prophetess. We're not quite sure what the etymology of it is. A really tempting etymology is to say that it's Siobula, which is a Doric variant. If you think about, again, these different variants of the Greek language and the Greek alphabet, Siobula might be the Doric variant of Theobule, which means the divine will. But something like that is sort of what it's about. So there are a bunch of different Sibyls. There's one, for the most famous one is at Delphi, right? The prophetess at Delphi is a Sibyl. But the Cumean one has this particular connection to Rome, and especially to Augustus. And Virgil did not invent the idea that her prophecies are kind of partial or patchy. What he did is he gave that idea poetic significance and gave you this incredible image that you can draw so much from. But the idea is actually part of the story. There's a wonderful story, which we get recorded among other places in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, about the early history of Rome. Before Rome was a republic, before it was an empire, and before it was a republic, when it was ruled by kings, King Tarquin was confronted with this old woman, and she came and offered 9 books of prophecies to King Tarquin, and Dionysius says he declined to purchase them owing to the exorbitant price. She burned 3 and offered the remaining 6 to Tarquin. He refused, she burned 3 more, and he relented. And these 3 books became the Sibylline books that were kept. The Romans kept them and genuinely do seem to have had texts that they consulted at crucial periods throughout their history. But part of the mythos of them, part of the idea of them is that they are already burned. They come to you partial, which is how the past comes to us. It's how our prophecies or ideas about the future come to us, right? It's not that they're not real. It's that they're already kind of broken up and damaged. They have what scholars would call lacunae, gaps in them in the text. And so that's baked into the idea of the Sibylline books. And the other part of it, of course, is then editing. So this is also about the history of literary transmission, because not only do we have, like, let's say, for instance, we have only one manuscript of Beowulf, right? And it comes to us slightly damaged. Then you have the question of editing, of transmission. Who copied this manuscript? And did they make changes? And did they make changes that were for the good of the integrity of the text? Or did they intervene for reasons of their own? This is also very much an issue during Virgil's time, because Augustus, the once and future king, the first emperor of Rome, part of his rebuilding project is he has the Sibylline books edited. We get this in Suetonius' Life of Augustus. Suetonius writes, after he finally had assumed the office of Pontifex Maximus on the death of Lepidus, he collected whatever prophetic writings of Greek or Latin origin were in circulation anonymously or under the names of authors of little repute. So all of these different, I mean, the Sibyls were not the only ones who were prophesying, and the Cumean Sibyl was not the only Sibyl. There's a bunch of different prophecies on record, some of them pertaining, of course, to the future of Rome. He has them all collected and burned more than 2,000 of them, retaining only the Sibylline books and making a choice even among those. And so this is a massive redaction project. This is like the Epstein files times a million, right? Like squared and cubed over and over again. It's like, there's all this information we would really like to know, but only the quote unquote correct ones are being preserved. And so this is a version of official history. This is something that, rulers or aspiring rulers in this case do when they want to gain control of the narrative, is they edit out the stuff that they don't like or that they think is unfavorable, and they keep only the things that they consider official. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all always motivated or self-interested. It just means that the question is there for Augustus, right? Is he the rightful king who was promised? Is he the prophesied ruler? Or is he a kind of pretender to the throne who has taken control and is manipulating people for his own gain? All of that is put before us in this sixth book of the Aeneid, which is all about the future of Rome and culminates in a prophecy of Augustus. Now, we're not going to get to that today. We're just going to get to the descent into the underworld today, but that's where we're headed, and that's why this prophecy is so significant for Virgil. It's also significant for everybody afterward, and this is why the Sibyls are on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, because after Augustus and after history had unfolded and people started becoming Christian and looking back on this moment, they said, well, Augustus was an incredibly significant figure, but who was also an incredibly significant king of the world who came around this time? A little fella called Jesus. And so the tradition develops that the king of the world is sort of supposed to be Augustus. People think that there are all these prophecies that relate to the coming of Augustus. And there are even parts of Virgil's other works that seem to maybe describe the rising up of this boy to rule and all of that. But actually, unbeknownst to the powers of the world, it was Christ that was being prophesied. And these prophetesses, these Sibyls, were looking into the future, but as always, they were looking with a kind of partial vision, a sort of madness. They didn't fully understand the meaning of their own prophecies. And that's, of course, also quite true. It's true of artists, it's true of prophets, that you can have a vision or an insight without fully realizing until after the fact what the shape or the reality of that prophecy was. That's also part of our condition in history. I would say it's very consonant with my own experience when I feel in prayer that something has been sort of told to me about the future. Usually I don't know what that is until I look back afterwards. So prophecy is something that it mostly unfolds itself in retrospect. And that's what the church thought happened with the Old Testament prophets, right? That the Jewish prophets who were like Isaiah and Jeremiah in the Old Testament, they're looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And there are all these prophecies, especially in the book of Isaiah, about that. And people thought, oh, this is a son of David. This is going to be a king who rules over Israel and Jerusalem. And all of those things were true from the Christian perspective, but they were true in a totally radical way, that actually this was the Son of God. The new Israel was going to be like the church triumphant, and all of these things become kind of allegorized into this giant global cosmic story. And suddenly the prophecies take on this new meaning in retrospect. That's the point, for example, of the story of the road to Emmaus, when the disciples they meet the risen Christ. They don't know that it's the risen Christ, right? He's standing there in front of him, and then he opens the scriptures, and they see that these things that were right in front of them the whole time were actually about Jesus, were actually about the coming. So this is a very key theme in Christian theology, that prophecy is kind of revealed to you at the proper time. And even though you've always had the words, the meaning of the words is suddenly made clear in this radically new way. It's kind of like hiding in plain sight. And so many Christians throughout history have thought that was also true of of some of the Sibylline oracles, that some of the Sibyls, including the Sibyl of Cumae, the Sibyl of Delphi, were prophesying the coming of the king without knowing it. If you look in, for example, the work of it's called the Divine Institutes of Lactantius. So this is like a 3rd century AD Christian. He's very interested in all the different Sibyls, and he mentions not just the Delphic and the Cumean Sibyl, but the Persian, the Libyan Sibyl. There were all these different ones from around and about, and they come up for a long time in history. In fact, in some cases still, we think of the Sibyls as like these pagan prophetesses who actually have this real insight, kind of like Balaam in the Old Testament. It's this idea of general revelation, that you don't have all of the information, but the Magi are another example of these foreign kings that see the star and are able to interpret using kind of natural reason and natural insight. They're able to understand there's a king and we need to go and worship him and all of that. The Sibyls are kind of like that too. One place that this shows up is if you know the famous kind of da 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 dies irae dies illa. This is a prophecy of the end days. And the full text of that portion is dies irae, dies illa, solvet saeculum in favilla, teste David cum Sibylla. That day of wrath, that dreadful day, shall heaven and earth in ashes lay, as David and the Sibyl say. So they're saying David, the king of Jerusalem, prophesied and spoke out and sang the Psalms about the Messiah coming, and that would come from his line. And this is all within good kind of Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition. But the Sibyl shows up in there too. There's another one of her recurring character appearances, right? Is that she is the kind of archetype of the pagan who does not have the special revelation, but whose insight into kind of matters arcane and divine is true enough that she can see there is a king coming, that she is also a prophetess. And this is why the Sibyls are on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That the space that they occupy is the same space that the Old Testament prophets also occupy. So they're kind of like dotted around the room. You've got Jeremiah, you've got Isaiah, you've got all these different Old Testament prophets, but interspersed among them, you've also got these Sibyls. You've got the Persian Sibyl, the Delphic Sibyl, the Libyan Sibyl, the Cumean Sibyl is there with her killer biceps, and the Erythraean Sibyl, which sounds like a random one, but these are actually all very carefully chosen because the Persian one, they're each from regions of the world, right? Persia is in Asia, Delphi obviously in Greece, Cumae in Italy, Libya in Africa. And Erythrae is an Ionian city in Asia Minor. So this is the Ionian region kind of at the edge of what is now Turkey. And that was another region of the ancient world that Michelangelo kind of includes. It's very carefully chosen to give this picture, this message that the stones cry out, right? That there is this general testimony, general revelation. There has been insight into the coming of the Christian Messiah, even among the Gentiles, right? Of course, or maybe not of course, but wonderfully, that is also how many Christians have viewed Virgil himself, that he is pressing his nose up against the glass, not just of the coming of the Roman Empire, but in his awareness, his artistic awareness that something big is coming to an end and something new is beginning. He thinks maybe that he's talking about the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, and he certainly is, but that is also this kind of smaller part of this larger epochal transition from the pagan world to the Christian world. And so this is something T.S. Eliot, in his famous essay, Virgil in the Christian World, writes about this. Obviously, Dante has Virgil in exactly that role of the guide that can show you everything there is to know before salvation, right? He can give you insight into the full scope of reality from down to the pits of hell up to the very pinnacle of the Mount of Purgatory. But then, tragically, he vanishes as Dante moves on into paradise because he can't cross that line into the Christian world. He's just at the threshold of it. And so that's why this book and this figure of the Sibyl has become so profoundly important for subsequent literary history, is that we're talking here about not just a relationship to the past and the future and kind of what can we know, but also about the grand cycles of history and the way in which, pre-Christian peoples kind of key themselves into truths, right? We have this natural reason that gets us to these core eternal truths. Of course, the Greek philosophers are all about eternal truths. This is also true of many Roman thinkers. And those truths, because they're true, right, speak of or hint of this grander transformation. That's the Christian idea anyway, of like why this is such a pivotal key book in history. And so, we've done a lot about Homer, so you guys know I love Homer. And nowadays we think of Homer kind of as the great epic poet of the ancient world. And in many ways, I still think that's true. But if you want to know my verdict, we've been kind of teasing and talking about, like, is Virgil better or is Homer better? A lot of people think Virgil's just a knockoff, just a cheap copy, just whatever. I don't think that's true at all. I think that Virgil is the guy who gathers up all that has gone before into this one poem, and it's condensed and it's powerful and it's sad and melancholy, and it has this enormous kind of significance. It's like a seed. It has this huge, like, embryonic significance for everything that was going to come ahead and come next. And so not just the vates of the Sibyl, but the vates of the poet Virgil. Incredibly powerful and important. And for most of Western literary criticism, most of the history of Western literature, that was the view, that Virgil, whatever else, was kind of the apex of what the pagan world had to offer to the Christian world. So here we go. We're up on the threshold. We're now arriving at the Euboean colony of Cumae, and it's very 300. If you've seen the movie 300, I talk about that movie a lot because it has this kind of cartoony, it's literally a graphic novel, and it does a lot of things that are not in the original sources, and there's all sorts of things that, like, you can't take them exactly at face value. But for all that, I actually think it has a lot that's really true to the spirit of this art, to the mystery of it, to the kind of madcap derangement, the strangeness, the sense that the world is pulsing with superhuman power. That's very much present in the consultation with the prophetess that we get in 300. So if you've seen that scene, again, there's a lot in there that is just totally made up. There's this weird kind of lecherous relationship between the prophet keepers and the prophetess, and she is hugely sexualized. She's like kind of got this heaving bosom under this very thin gown, and all of that is actually not quite what we, I think, should think of when we think of the Cumean Sibyl. She's actually much more like the Michelangelo, kind of this huge butch figure that is terrifying. But the idea that this is a human body, a virgin female, it's repeated again and again in Virgil, that this is a virgin, because she's being kept pure for the god who kind of invades. And the language that Virgil uses is the language of a rider and a horse, right? There's kind of like a neighing stallion that's tossing its head, and the God has to put the bit in its mouth and bridle it and take the reins. That's how Phoebus Apollo, the god who gives the truth to mortals, that's how he uses this woman. And so that kind of image where the woman is like lifted into the air and she's taken over by another force, that's all in 300, and very much that is what we get here. But unlike 300, where the prophetess is kind of this waif that's retiring and just taken over by the powers that be, the Sibyl fights. I mean, those like biceps really get put to use. She's sort of like panting in this crazy battle, wrestling match with the god. And that's what Aeneas is confronted with when he comes to ask, like, what am I supposed to do next? Because he needs to know how to get to the underworld. He needs to talk with the spirits of the dead. The Sibyl is supposed to be the one that tells him. So I'm going to read you now again this passage. Now we're in book 6. This is my translation in Alexandrines as usual. And here's what happens. Cut from the flank of that Euboean rock. So again, we get the reminder that this is a Euboean history here. Cut from the flank of that Euboean rock, a cave, enormous, with 100 entrances and mouths through which the Sibyl's 100 answering voices flow. We reached the threshold. Ask your fate, the virgin said. The god is here, the god! And as she spoke this way before the doors, her face went white and colorless, her hair in sudden disarray, her bosom heaved, her chest swelled with a feral rage. She seemed to grow and sounded more than mortal, breathing in the might of the approaching god. You're holding back from prayer? Trojan, she said, Aeneas, holding back. Oh no, the lips of this great thunder-addled cave will never part until you offer prayer. And having said those words, she ceased. I mean, it's better. I said it's like 300. It's better than 300, man. This is so good. It's called a theophany when a god appears visibly. This is kind of like that, but it's more of a possession. Right, and there are hymns, Homeric hymns, and literature from before Virgil that give us this outcry, Deus, ecce Deus, the God is here, the God. And so it's sort of like a verbal theophany or something, if that's not a contradiction in terms. The 100 answering voices of the Sibyl, one of the many myths about the Sibyl, like I say, she's kind of this recurring character. There's a bunch of different stories about her. One of them is that she was this virgin that Apollo loved, and Apollo's role in these god-human stories is often to be unlucky in love. Apollo loved her, offered her any gift she wanted. She asked to live for 1,000 years. Then when she rebuffed him, he cursed her to age throughout those 1,000 years. And so her body withered away as she kind of like crumpled up, and only her voice was left. So the voice of the Sibyl is this incredibly powerful, important thing. And so this idea that she's got 100 answering voices flowing through the caves is part of that. Then she's being taken over, right? The god is here, the god. And this is a section. I was interested as I reviewed some of the other available translations. This is a place where people are very tempted to make the Sibyl more coherent than I think she actually is. I tried to translate as much as possible with the kind of ambiguity. Kessas in vota precesque, tros aenea kessas, and it's all broken up in different lines. And are you ceasing? Are you shrinking from prayers, Aeneas? Are you ceasing? Because the mouth of the cave won't open. A few of the other translations I read, John Dryden, why this delay? The powers invoke, the prayers alone can open this abode, else vain are my demands, and dumb the gods. Theodore Williams, only unto prayer this haunted cave may its vast lips unclose. On with thy vows and prayers. That's the part that I'm not so sure. A lot of translations make the Sibyl a little bit too encouraging here. Go on, pray, right? Instead, she asks him a question, are you holding back? She doesn't actually necessarily say, like, you should want to know what I have to tell you. She just says, are you afraid? Are you chicken? And that, of course, is the invitation for Aeneas to kind of walk into this dangerous new stage in his journey. which he does because he's our hero and he's now at least a little bit kind of on top of things. And he is told that he has a task before he can enter the underworld. There's a wonderful line that the gates of the underworld are easy to enter, but hard to climb out of. They stand open all day and night, as of course we know they do, because you can die at any time. It's coming back that's the hard part. And in order to come back, you need a charm, a gift for Proserpina. Now, Proserpina is the Roman Latin name for Persephone, and you may know the myth of Persephone, that she was abducted, raped, stolen by Hades. There's a famous sculpture of this by Bernini, who has the image of the god, the underworld god Hades, violently grabbing this struggling, beautiful young girl. Persephone was everything Hades was not. She was the embodiment of life and springtime and fertility. She was the daughter of Demeter, who's the goddess of grain, or Ceres to the Romans. And so this abduction caused terrible chaos on Earth, is the story, that Demeter, the mother of Persephone, was in such sorrow that she allowed no corn to grow. The earth was plunged into perpetual cold and snow and frost. Nothing came from the earth. There was famine. And obviously this couldn't endure. And the god said, Demeter, you must, you must kind of get over this, or we've got to somehow fix this, which is how Hermes went down to the underworld to try to rescue Persephone from Hades. She had already broken the cardinal rule, which is when you're in the underworld, you don't eat anything or you have to stay. And so Hades says, I got her right now. Now she has to be my bride. However, Hermes, ever clever, ever the trickster, said, she only ate 6 seeds from a pomegranate. So the deal will be that she'll be above ground for 6 months out of the year and below ground for 6 months out of the year. And that is why we have 6 months of spring and summer and 6 months of winter and fall, when Demeter mourns her daughter who is down in the underworld. This is what you call an etiology, a myth that tells a cause of something. And it becomes a fixture of the idea of the underworld that Hades is merciless, unforgiving. He is the dark, right? He is the god in charge of barring the gates back to life. At least, if we believe Homer, we think that nobody really comes back from the underworld. We're about to complicate that, by the way, but there is this other figure down there, Persephone, Proserpina, who has a tender heart, and she can be appealed to. This is part of the myth of Orpheus, who goes down to try to get his love, Eurydice. If you've been watching Sandman, which is an adaptation of this Neil Gaiman graphic novel, by the way, just side note, pop culture wreck, Sandman is awesome. I feel a little weird saying that because it's kind of, I don't know, it's spotty, it's amateurish in places, very melodramatic, almost campy in its level of melodrama, and yet there's something about it that is creative and weird and interesting and just so much more distinctive than a lot of the stuff that is currently streaming. And that's what I liked about Severance. It's also what I like about Sandman. Apparently it's doing really well, despite the fact that Neil Gaiman has currently been, there's been a scandal around his bad sexual behavior, and I think the show is going to end fairly soon, and also it's not getting great critic ratings or Rotten Tomato scores and all of that. But a lot of people are really digging it, and it seems to be making Netflix a lot of money. Anyway, if you've been watching it, in the second season, there's a version of the Orpheus myth, and you get Hades and Persephone as these giant figures looming over Orpheus as he sings his song and asks for Eurydice back. Those are the figures that Aeneas must now go and confront. And if he wants to come back, he needs to bring the golden bough, which Persephone loves. It's a bough is a branch of a tree. He needs to go and pluck it. And it's kind of like the sword and the stone, in that it will come out of the tree easily for anyone who is destined righteously to go into the underworld and come back. Anyone who is definitely meant to have a katabasis, the golden bough will fall away and you can take it, but it's impossible to pluck if you aren't meant to go. And so Aeneas goes and plucks it. Of course, it comes off for him, and that means that he and he alone is destined to go down into the underworld. This will explain, if you've ever heard of a book called The Golden Bough, that's where that title comes from. It's one of these big anthropological works by a Scottish anthropologist called James Fraser. And the idea is basically that the Golden Bough is a work of scholarship about how all myths are kind of related, interconnected to one another. And there are these types of myths that get replayed again and again. Big influence on, for example, Joseph Campbell, and a major reason why we talk now about the hero's journey, right? Which made its way via Joseph Campbell into George Lucas and Star Wars. A lot of screenwriters kind of use this template of the hero's journey. I am very skeptical of this whole thing, I will say, because it comes out of this project from like the 19th century where people are trying essentially to like naturalize all religion. And one of the scandalous things about the Golden Bough is that the Jesus story is included among these myths, right? And it made people very shocked at the time. But it also is kind of an attempt to find natural origins, very much kind of akin to the Freudian project. And indeed, there's a lot of Jung in Joseph Campbell, this idea that we tell these stories about supernatural entities, but really underneath the surface there is, in Fraser's case, it's like this original event of a dead king, that you have to kill the king in order to found a civilization, and that becomes kind of the origin myth. Interestingly, the Golden Bough story itself is only very tangentially related to that thesis, by the thinnest of possible threads. And that is something that makes me very skeptical, is that like a lot of the time when you actually dig under the surface, yes, there are these similar themes that we come back to because we do have a shared human nature. But the Golden Bough story is a good example of something that seems incredibly distinctive, especially as presented here in Virgil. I can't think of a lot of myths that are like it. I mean, I made mention of the sword and the stone, but the sword makes Arthur into the king. The bough makes Aeneas into like somebody that can go into the underworld. It's like only these, it's like if you squint, you can see these common themes, but there is also originality and distinctiveness. And by the time you get to Virgil, you're really not dealing with like these like primitive subconscious urges. You're dealing with a very sophisticated artistic creation. So I really think that Fraser is kind of has had an outsized and unnecessary influence on our thinking about this stuff. And one of the things it's done is it's made all movies basically look the same, because we think that it's very smart and clever to be like, oh yes, these are the key themes that but like that's not all of what storytelling is. Storytelling is also original insight, it's madness, it's divine kind of Cumean Sibyl styles peering into the void. And wonderfully, just before Fraser's book came out, The Golden Bough came out in 1890. And in 1871, so before that, you get a beautiful parody of the whole enterprise, which was obviously in the air already. This was part of the kind of 19th century intellectual culture. You get this spoof of The Golden Bough before The Golden Bough called The Key to All Mythologies, which is part of this book Middlemarch, a wonderful, wonderful novel by George Eliot. That's the pen name of a female author. And Eliot writes this sweeping kind of social novel of manners, wonderful kind of story of these various different families interacting with one another. And one of the characters, Mr. Casaubon, is basically a Fraser figure, but he's doomed never to finish his work. He's always working on his masterpiece. It's called The Key to All Mythologies. And he's always kind of trying to be so exhaustive that he never finishes anything. So I really like that as kind of a footnote to The Golden Bough, because I really do feel that like this project, there's something kind of wrong with this project. And you see why in Virgil, where the themes that are there are certainly of old, right? Ancient themes that he's picking up and on and drawing from Homer and Greek myth and so on and so forth. But there is something completely distinctive about this story of Aeneas and the unforgettable character of the Sibyl as she appears in Book 6, the unhinged prophetess beneath the nether crags. And next week, we will follow Aeneas as having acquired the Golden Bough, the gift for Persephone. He will descend at last into the underworld. But that's for next time. For now, let's take a break and do It Figures. This is a segment at the end of every episode where I like to tell you about figures of speech. These are really, I think, very useful things to know about. They are ancient words, descriptors for habits, kinds of ways that people use language. And there are some that apply mostly in poetry and some that apply mostly in rhetoric and some that apply in both. But once you know about them, you will see them everywhere. I was just explaining to my dad what a subtweet was, and I was realizing a subtweet is basically praeteritio, one of the figures of speech that we've learned about, where you talk about something without talking about it. And there's another really good one to talk about today that you will now see everywhere, and it's called litotes. So litotes, in its purest form, is just a double negative. And I know that you learned in English class that there's no such thing, that you shouldn't do a double negative. And broadly speaking, for spoken and written English, modern English, that's true. It hasn't always been true in English. It's not true in other languages, like French, for instance. You do have two negatives to make a negative. But if in English, if I say not, that technically makes a positive, right? Like I'm not going to the party means like I am going, right? Or it's like, it's not, I'm not saying I'm mad, but I'm not mad, right? And it's kind of a slangy, like cutesy way of talking that we wouldn't use in, say, an academic paper. So double negatives are technically illegal, but they can be used for terrific rhetorical effect if you do it well. And this is kind of how litotes works. Is when you say that I'm not something, you get a sort of softer or a more suggestive or nuanced version of saying that you are that thing. And the negative involved doesn't just have to be a negation. In other words, it doesn't have to be just a not. It can also be like a negative thing. For example, you won't be sorry is kind of a litotes, right? Because when you're sorry, you wish you hadn't done something. You won't be sorry means you will be glad, right? You will be happy that you've done this. It's not unlike, right? Not is as a honest to goodness double negative. It's not unlike a masterpiece. There's a certain qualification to that where it's like, I'm not sure it's a masterpiece, but it's not unlike a masterpiece. Like we're getting there when you're not quite ready to say something, or when you don't want to overstate something, but it is kind of, you won't be sorry is like a way of saying you're really going to be happy. But I want to say it in a way that seems kind of like a little bit more measured. There's a great one in the passage that I just read to you about the Sibyl. And it's I actually translated it slightly differently than it shows up. So in my translation, it doesn't quite show up as a litotes. But you get a list in this description of the Sibyl of negatives. Non, nec. Non comptae mansere comae. Her hair did not stay arranged. So she lost her hair composure, right? Her hair kind of went wild. And so I've translated it as her hair in sudden disarray. The non color unis, non voltus, non color unis. There was no one color in her face. She lost all her color. And then finally, her chest swelled with a feral rage. She seemed to grow nec mortale sonans. She was not sounding mortal. So mortal is when you die. She is not sounding mortal, so she is sounding, immortal, right? Nec mortale sound. I've said she sounded more than mortal. And what's wonderful about this is the suggestiveness of it, because when you describe something like a prophetess connecting with the divine, you have to do it with great care and subtlety, so that you don't get corny. It's obviously impossible to look head on at the divine, and so you have to kind of do it in all these roundabout ways. And that's what Virgil is doing here. She sounded more than mortal. If he had said like her voice sounded like thunder or her voice was raspy, then you really only get one limited thing. But when I say her voice sounded more than mortal or did not sound mortal, then suddenly your mind will construct all manner of things, right? All kinds of sound effects are going on in your head when I say that if I got too specific about them, they would kind of fall apart. And so that's another great use of litotes, that she sounded nec mortale. It's like, whoa, what did she sound like, right? I know what she didn't sound like. Now I'm going to just go wild imagining kind of what she did sound like. And by the way, that's another great thing about Sandman is the sound effects when like divine entities or demons speak are incredible. So that's kind of what Virgil accomplishes with this litotes. But there's all sorts of uses of litotes. It's a great word, fun to say, and you will see it everywhere. All right. Finally, a mailbag question. Mailbag questions come to me now through Substack, which is my favorite platform. It's where I do a lot of my writing that doesn't show up in other publications. If you want to follow the stuff that I do, the great way to do it is go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and become a subscriber. Please do. I would really love to have you along. If you want to support my work by becoming a paid subscriber, that would be most welcome, and I'd be very, very grateful. But both paid and free subscribers can message me using the DM feature on Substack. And today I have one from Gina, which I think will be relevant to a lot of you. She says, I am considering online college. I own a salon where I work flexible hours, about 20 hours a week. I was offered a part-time position at a classical tutorial. We teach 2 days a week, and then the students are homeschooled the other 3 days. I will be teaching first grade. I have an associate's degree and want to get something that will be helpful in teaching students K through 12. There's nothing I can do online or even close that is either classics or classical education. I can, however, do online for history, English, or philosophy. Which do you think would be most helpful? Further, as philosophy is the most intriguing of the three to me, do you think it's even possible to do a philosophy program online in an asynchronous format without live debate and dialogue with professors and students? Well, okay, so going from the beginning here, I think it's really cool that you're studying this to teach to kids, because there's nothing that will make you realize whether or not you understand something more quickly than trying to explain it to a child. Children have incredible nonsense detectors. They know when you're not really like saying something that makes sense. They ask all sorts of questions. The questions they ask are often very simple, but very precise and insightful. And philosophy is actually a great subject to teach to kids. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get them like reading Kant or whatever, but you can read Kant and the greats, and you can educate yourself and then sharpen your mind through this teaching. So there's a good chance that by the end of this, you'll be a better philosopher than like most philosophy grad students who often get trapped in these incomprehensible, jargon-laden ideas that they then could never explain to a child. You're right that the resources are scattered and difficult, especially for people who don't have time to go full-time to school. And that's why I say this, I hope, will be relevant to a lot of people who listen, because I know a lot of us are not like about the life of going to become a perpetual student, but you want something that you can do in like a half an hour or an hour a day. One thing I've recommended before for a variety of topics is just kind of rifling through the podcast app and the Yale online courses. There's a lot of really great offerings, just lectures that are put out by Yale that you can listen to. Obviously, endless resources online for reading things. But that brings us to your next question, which is like, is it possible to do philosophy with just yourself, alone in a room? And my answer to that is, well, kind of. Part of what books are for, philosophy books especially, if you read Plato's Phaedrus, he talks about this, books can't have a conversation with you, but the dialogue format, the philosophical dialogue format, is invented in part so that you can have a conversation with the book. So you can develop as a thinker with any book if you're having a conversation, if you're annotating, if you're asking the book questions, if you're thinking about it, if you're rereading, right? So if you're really an engaged and active reader, then you can become in a kind of conversation with the great minds of the past. And that's kind of the point, right? My advice to you as just when you're just reading texts, when you're reading books, is watch out for the attitude, and I slip into this all the time. Watch out for the assumption that what you're there to do is like receive instruction from the master. Especially, I think, conservatives and people like me who like kind of the tradition. It's very easy for us to think of books as like, oh, Aristotle said this, and that is the authority, right? It's very easy to fall into authority mode. But that's not actually, I think, what most great philosophers would have hoped for or intended. The way you really respect the tradition is by beating them up, by engaging with these minds, these great thinkers, as kind of fellow travelers, and asking, is this really true? Can I live this way? What happens if I practice this insight, right? If you read the Nicomachean Ethics and he tells you, like, friendship is a virtue, well, what does that mean? Is it like courage? Is it like wisdom, right? How can I practice friendship as a virtue? Like, asking those questions and then trying things out in your life and coming back to those with that experience to the text is really crucial. So, like, don't treat the book as just something that, like, you need to sort of live up to or totally accept unquestioningly. That's not actually the most respectful way to treat a text, especially a philosophy text. But there's only so far, even in that mode, there's only so far you can go with books. And so you do at some point need some kind of community. You don't need a bunch of other professional philosophers. You don't necessarily even need the community that you have to be connected to the course that you're taking. You can do a reading course and then you can do it with friends and meet to discuss or whatever. But you need relationship, living relationship, because you need people that can check you and work against you and all of that. That's why I'm endorsing Aletheia Travel, by the way, is that getting together in a group, right, is something that is a genuinely necessary thing. That part can be hard. So I've got some resources for you. I asked a few friends, I looked around, and I'm going to put these links in the description of the show. So I hope that you will take a look at them. These are not the only things. These are the ones that looked like they might be helpful to you. I'd love to hear from other listeners if you have other recommendations for philosophy courses. But my number one rec is that my grad school alma mater, Oxford, which I love very dearly and still endorse, has this program called Lifelong Learning. And they are there basically to do exactly what you're doing. There are available chat components and forum and discussion components, but there's also like a reading list and a syllabus that you can do kind of in your own time. So that's just Lifelong Learning, lifelong-learning.ox.ac.uk, and they have a philosophy course called Introduction to Philosophy online. You can check that out. There's a couple organizations that actually do philosophy for children. I can't vouch for them in the way that I can vouch for Oxford, but they would be worth checking out. One of them is called Sapere, to know, and it's sapere.org.uk. And this is part of what's called Philosophy for Children, P4C. So it's worth looking into that too. There's Plato, Plato, the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization. And these are ways that maybe you can sharpen your skills specifically in how do I relate to kids at this level about these ideas. Kids are natural philosophers. They ask why a lot, but it can help to have people kind of coaching you on like what ways to take that further. And then there are a few like renegade resources, philosophers and scholars that I have enjoyed reading in the past. They may get a little bit more political than you are looking for, but maybe not. Maybe that's part of what you're interested in is political philosophy, and not just, metaphysics and ethics. So I would recommend Michael Millerman, Millerman, and you can go to millerman.com. He's got michaelmillerman.com. He's got a bunch of courses. And then Montana Classical College, which is a Substack at montanaclassicalcollege.substack.com. As always, with all programs, learning programs and scholarships and grad degrees and everything, the one thing I always tell people first and last is it's about the people. Even if you're looking at an institution that has done some woke stuff, that you have all the criticisms of the academy that I share, and you think like, oh no, the administration here is super woke or whatever. If you find a professor, there are still great professors at the great schools, and so reaching out to people and getting in touch with them and discussing in advance like what you want to do and getting to know whether this is somebody that you trust to become your kind of leader in this ongoing discussion. That's the key. Relationships first and last. And that, I think, is what Plato was on about in the Phaedrus as well, and how you should engage with the books too. And with me. And so I'm so thankful that you have these questions, that you write in. Please keep it coming. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you don't already, just hit subscribe wherever you're listening. Rate it 5 stars, share it around, let people know. It's always such a joy in my life to be talking about these great texts with you. I'm excited to keep going into the underworld, deeper into the katabasis next time. And I'll see you then for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.